It's almost impossible to take great photos without a basic understanding of exposure. But exposure can be one of the hardest concepts for beginners to grasp. But if you're like some people, right about now you might be thinking, my camera has automatic exposure, so why do I need to bother? I'll just let the camera figure it out for me. Well, if you have that attitude, I can guarantee that you won't get the best possible results. And learning to take great photos is what this DVD is all about. So, what is exposure anyway? Exposure refers to how much light is allowed into the camera when you take a picture, and also how sensitive the camera is to that light when it strikes the image sensor. A picture that is overexposed, meaning too much light came into the camera when the picture was taken, will look bright and washed out. A picture that is underexposed, meaning not enough light came into the camera when the picture was taken, will look too dark and murky. But a picture that is properly exposed will look like this. Fortunately, taking a picture that is properly exposed is easy with today's cameras. They all have built-in light meters and onboard computers that can automatically choose settings that will guarantee that your exposure won't look too light or too dark. However, as you gain more experience, you'll want to take your camera off the fully automatic settings and experiment with the different creative exposure choices that you can make with an SLR. For example, you may want to choose exposure settings that can give you an effect like this, instead of what the camera would have taken on automatic. Or this, instead of this on automatic. These are just two examples of how you can choose different exposure settings in order to get great photos that probably wouldn't happen if you just leave the camera on automatic mode. It's purely a matter of personal preference when it comes to determining the appropriate use of exposure settings to creatively enhance a photograph. But it all begins with an understanding of how exposure works. Your digital SLR has literally dozens of buttons, switches, and menu settings, but don't let that confuse you, because when you boil it all down, there are basically only 3 settings on your camera that control exposure. They are the aperture of the lens, the shutter speed, and ISO. Exposure is simply the product of an equation made up of these 3 settings. And if one of them is changed, then there has to be an opposite change to at least one of the other settings to keep the exposure in balance. As we've already seen, the aperture of the lens can be opened or closed to control the amount of light reaching the image sensor. Shutter speed is another way of controlling how much light comes into the camera by regulating the length of time that the shutter is held open when the picture is taken. And ISO is an adjustable setting for controlling how sensitive the camera is to light. Let's talk more about ISO for a second. ISO on a digital camera is the equivalent of film speed. Remember buying rolls of film at speeds of 100, 400, or 800? The higher the number, the better the film was for shooting in low light. Well, digital cameras have been calibrated to have equivalent ISO settings. Higher ISO numbers are better for low light situations, which sounds good at first, but it comes at a price, because your pictures won't look as good. When you use a higher ISO, you are electronically amplifying the signal that is being generated by the image sensor. And the more the signal is amplified, the lower the picture quality will be. On most SLRs, the lowest possible ISO setting is usually either 100 or 200. So for best results, I suggest that you put your ISO on the lowest setting and keep it there. We'll see in a few minutes how you'll know when it's necessary to increase the ISO. But as I said, most of the time you'll want to keep it on the lowest setting. It's not a setting that you should routinely change. So if we take ISO out of the equation, it's even easier to see how a change to aperture or shutter speed requires an equal and opposite change to the other setting. In fact, all of these combinations of aperture and shutter speed will result in the same exposure, meaning they all let exactly the same amount of light into the camera. So the question is, if there are several combinations of shutter speed and aperture in a given situation that will result in a technically correct exposure, is there really any difference among them? Well, the answer is yes. There are important creative differences among these choices. The easiest way to see the differences is to compare the effects you get with different shutter speeds. In this example, neither one of these photos, taken just seconds apart, is under or overexposed. But look how blurry one is compared to the other. So even though the exposure is technically correct for both of them, they don't look the same. Fast shutter speeds, such as 1/1000th of a second, will freeze action, but slow shutter speeds, such as 1/10th of a second, can be used to create motion blur. Sometimes motion blur can be used intentionally as a creative tool, but other times it's just a mistake that can ruin your picture. So why would you let the camera decide what shutter speed is best for your picture? The camera can't tell if you're shooting a fast-moving runner, a flower, or flowing water. So one of the best ways to start taking better pictures is to choose the shutter speed yourself that best suits the subject matter and/or effect that you want to achieve in your photo. But another way to shoot creatively is to choose your own aperture so that you can control the depth of field. Depth of field is the distance in front of and beyond the subject that appears to be in focus. It can be anywhere from a fraction of an inch wide to virtually infinite. It is the aperture setting of the lens that determines the depth of field. The smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. A small aperture, such as f/16, will make everything in the photo appear sharp. But choosing a large aperture, such as f/2.8, can be used to blur a cluttered background so that only the subject is in sharp focus. As I said before, it's purely a matter of personal preference when it comes to determining the appropriate use of shutter speed and aperture to creatively enhance a photograph. And that's the subject of our next chapter.